Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of guests that we have for today. First, we have Ms. Carmela Monk Crawford, who is the editor of Message Magazine. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine, and we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who is the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, it's great having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there's been an interesting quote in jurisprudence. And the quote says, there is a crucial difference between government speech endorsing religion, which is the establishment clause's, thing that it forbids, and private speech endorsing religion, which is the free speech and free exercise clauses protected. That's Sandra Day O'Connor. That is a quote that came from her in a 1990 Supreme Court decision that helped to explain the real clear terms of the importance of both the Establishment Clause as you juxtapose that against the Free Exercise Clause and protection of religious freedom for all. Ironically, Justice O'Connor passed away not too long ago, and she left a remarkable legacy as it relates to church-state jurisprudence. I cannot imagine when she first came on the court and was put on by probably one of the most conservative presidents of the United States that we've seen in quite some time in Ronald Reagan, that we would have never seen a situation where she became what many people call the swing vote as it relates to all of these matters that we are now talking about on a regular basis as it relates to religious liberty and how the government should operate in accordance thereof. Bettina, when we think about Justice O'Connor as being someone who obviously was the first woman that was on the court, but turned out to be probably the swing vote and maybe impacted more court decisions during her term on the court than maybe anybody that I can think in recent history, it seems that we could not really look at religious freedom without, to some degree, thanking Justice O'Connor for the work that she's done.
Well, you're absolutely right, Orlin, but let me start by saying you could not have chosen a more appropriate panel to discuss Sandra Day O'Connor as four women. So yes, you're right. She carved out this sort of centre ground on the issue of religious freedom, on the two religion clauses of the First Amendment. She was that swing vote. And so she was not, she didn't identify as someone on the far right. She didn't identify as someone on the far left. She maintained that centre ground, but she did make some very significant contributions, especially when it comes to the idea that the government should not be seen to be endorsing a particular religious viewpoint. Mm-hmm. She came up with the endorsement test, which was sort of an addendum to the Lemon test, which was the test that courts up until recently applied to determine whether an Establishment Clause violation had taken place. So that really, I think, was the nub of her contribution to constitutional jurisprudence in this area. One of my favorite quotes from her is exactly on this point. And she said, those who want to renegotiate the boundaries between church and state, they better be prepared to answer the difficult question of why would we swap something that served us so well for something that served others so poorly? So she was a champion of that clear separation between church and state. It's a legacy, unfortunately, that we probably won't see much of in the future.
Orlin, exactly. I agree with Bettina as far as the legacy that Justice O'Connor left, and really that balance and pragmatism that we saw from her as far as respecting both the free exercise of religion, but also protecting from the establishment. Therefore, and really, I think, as Bettina said, that's what we have been missing, or that's what we're missing, from recent church-state religious freedom cases, unfortunately. And I love that with, so Bettina mentioned the endorsement test that Justice O'Connor is known for, and how she took the Lemon test and she recognized when I was reading about her, what she referred to as the practical implications of these legal principles. And again, I think that in judicial decisions that we're seeing these days, we're not seeing justices recognize, well, what does this actually look like in practicality?
Yes.
And so, I really admire her work, and she certainly left a long legacy. I like also the fact that she surprised people with, the approach that she took. Again, I don't think that when you are nominating someone who serves for a life term, you should be able to assume or be able to predict exactly where they will land on various issues. So.
Carmela, when you think about the way Justice O'Connor did her work, it seemed like she had a clear, what I would call, respect for precedent. And the idea that although we may have differing points of view and society may be changing, the ability to be able to take the changing aspects of society and to work it really in conjunction with current precedent that exists by even creating like what we would call the endorsement test to work in conjunction with the Lemon test, which we realized after a while had its struggles. But she didn't come with the idea of get rid of the Lemon test and create something else. She came with the idea of let's work in conjunction with supporting it and respecting the idea of what you would look for as it relates to, the concepts of a precedent. I mean, and I found that to be quite unique from her perspective.
Right. Well, if I echoed my sister is here today, since this is the program with us on here, leave it to a woman to be practical regarding these ideas. Yes, we have to balance two or three really important competing constitutional principles, right? In today's jurisprudence, today's cases continue to balance that idea of free exercise and the Establishment Clause. People like me, keep everything separate. But in practicality and reality, there has to be this dance between ordinary people and the way government interacts with them, churches and church groups, governmental agencies. How do we dance together? So here now, she has a test that you can use. And so you got to wonder, why are people going to get rid of that practicality and a framework for how we do this dance together? But hey, I'm not going to cast any stones. I'm just saying it was practical.
Yeah, and what I love about the practicality of it is that she looks at the impact of how the government is acting, right? Like, what message does it send to those who are either the outsiders or the insiders based on, if it does look like endorsement. And I think that, that's an important piece to keep in mind, right? Like, are we telling some people that they are favored insiders and telling some people that they are the others, they're the disfavored outsiders? And, when I was reading up on her, and it was interesting to me, as you mentioned before, that, she plays the swing vote role, but also she has consistency in, government's participation in sending funds maybe to religious institutions or religious organizations versus things where they couldn't really have a neutral hand, such as prayers or displays or things of that nature. So I found it very interesting that she was able to make those practical distinctions as far as how that might impact her endorsement test.
Bettina, she talked about something that I found quite interesting, and it was a term of art that she called political community. And it seemed that she used to try to shape much of what she was doing as it relates to the Establishment Clause with the idea that you still have to protect the political community. When we hear political community and protection, you don't always put those together. But in her mind, she thought that community needed to be protected as she really went through her analysis of the Establishment Clause. What are your thoughts regarding that? Because I found that to be quite fascinating, to be honest.
It is fascinating. And I think as you read through her opinions, in many different cases, she had a particular vision of what America was and what it should be. And that is a vision of a pluralistic society where people of all faiths and no faiths can participate in the civic space equally and also enjoy the equal protection of the law, regardless of what they believed or didn't believe. And so you see her, in many different ways, sort of trying to outline that vision through her decision making. It puzzles me. As Carmela said, why the court saw fit to remove this sort of very practical way of dealing with these cases and removing that from the lower courts, because now the lower courts are in confusion. They can't use the Lemon test. They can't use the endorsement test. They have to come up with something that fits with the new text, history, and tradition approach that the court is taking. And it's an approach that is very alien to the type of society that and jurisprudential policy that Justice O'Connor championed through her tenure on the court.
Melissa, as somebody who's down on Capitol Hill on a regular basis, the idea that someone would be thinking about legislation as it relates to protecting a political community, where it looks like some of our legislation only focuses on a political community, it seems like you either have to go really hard in this direction or really hard in that direction. And if you don't find one side to be on, you're an outcast. But it seems that there was a certain practicality that we've kind of using that term here. But it seems like not only doesn't exist in the courts anymore, it seems like it doesn't even exist in the legislature anymore.
No, you're exactly right, Orlin. Unfortunately, what we see is legislation coming out that very specifically favors one segment of society. It enhances their rights or their freedoms, or it privileges or advantages them in some way. And again, as you were saying, as a society, we've become very upfront about that. Like, we don't even try and pretend anymore with the legislation, because that we are favoring this one segment of society over another, and that is absolutely troubling. I really appreciated the quote that Bettina shared that Justice O'Connor said, as far as here we have this established principle that has worked so well for us for so long, and we've seen work so poorly in other situations. Why are we now, as a nation, heading down a road where we've seen disasters take place time after time after time again? I very much appreciate her legacy, and perhaps there'll be an Oscar-winning movie that will take place that will revive the principles that she once established.
Carmela, when I just want to close out with this thought from you, the idea of when you see somebody who's made such an impact, in terms of how you really tried to gain the concept of more women even understand the importance of being part of what I would call this legal community. It seems like she was somebody that made a big difference and caused a lot of people to move in that direction.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And she was around when I was formulating what I wanted to be. I don't agree with everything, and I don't agree with everything that's in her legacy. But I do agree that on this point, this sensitivity to the Establishment Clause is very important, and a very important legacy that we should not be departing from.
And I think this is something that we all can learn from as it relates to court decisions and even legislature, that there's a practicality of the law that still should supersede some of the other things that we're seeing. There's a court case called St. Vincent Catholic Charities versus Ingham County Board of Commissioners. And in this particular case, we have St. Vincent, which is really driven by his faith to minister to the community of Lansing, Michigan. As a result, this organization, which is clearly a Christian organization, believes in biblical commandments, and it believes that it should be looking out for the least of these, for orphans, for widows, and in particular, refugees. For the last 40 years, St. Vincent has been providing these crucial services, helping individuals to understand the importance of resettling, understanding that this is a new territory that you're in, unfamiliar homes, the things we can do to kind of help you to get settled, picking you up from airports, and just really giving you computer training and other things that may be helpful to you in this new environment. But it looks as though St. Vincent also is in a situation where some of his activities, even though they're the only entity providing these type of services in the Lansing area, seem to be conflicting with some federally recognized rules and regulations, in particular, making sure that we know who you're allowed to assist if you are here legally or not here legally. So when you take a look at this particular case, and Jennifer, this is something obviously happening in the state of Michigan where you're also located. When you hear this type of activity, how do we try to find out, can we help our fellow man and still be in a situation where you potentially could be violating the law? And should one take precedent over the other? Or should we find a way for both of these, what I would call ideas or ideologues, to peacefully coexist?
You know, Orlin, I found this issue with St. Vincent to be just, it was so intriguing to me, because as I started doing research on this, I was like, oh, it looks as though, even though they're providing this great service, even though, you know, Ingham County has said they're providing this great service, and really the only government designated agency that's providing these services, that the county has been excluding them or trying to exclude them from programs to help them further their mission of providing these services because of religious beliefs. And it's not so much religious beliefs necessarily regarding refugees and the services that they provide them, but it's about religious beliefs dealing with same-sex marriage and another case altogether. And, you know, so I said, wow, this really looks like retaliation happening here. And, you know, the courts kind of seem to agree there that this looks like it's a case of retaliation and singling out someone for voicing their opinion on an issue, their sincerely held belief on an issue. And, you know, it's sad because, you know, by trying to stifle this group, the only people they're really impacting are the refugees who need services in the Lansing area. So that's concerning to me as a resident of the state of Michigan, for sure.
Absolutely. And, you know, Orlin, it's interesting because the government loved the fact that this organization was motivated to provide this service until it was no longer convenient for them, right? As far as, and that's the thing, is they have allowed this situation that they oppose to exist, right? Again, because this is the social service, it's the maybe the only one in the area, but if it's not the only one, it's the one who's doing by far creating the biggest impact. And so it's just kind of it doesn't sit well that now that it's no longer sort of that their stance or their understanding of the biblical relationship between man and woman and marriage is no longer the majority opinion of the nation. Now they are being penalized because of that, simply because of that. Again, it's not that they had an opposition to serving a particular population group, the LGBTQ population group. That's not it at all. It's just that as an organization, as a religious organization, they had that stance for their individual members. But again, we know that faith motivates so much of the social service work that happens here in the United States, and our communities, including the government, rely on the faith communities doing that. Can you imagine how much more it would cost the government, or how much more it would then impact us as taxpayers if the faith-based organizations were taken out of the equation as far as providing these essential, social service programs? Not only that, the population group that we're talking about, this immigrant population group, this is, again, people of faith are the ones who see themselves as called to serve the disadvantaged communities that already have the established relationships, or take the time to establish relationships, trusting relationships with these population groups. So they can do this well, and they should be allowed to do it.
Ironically, Bettina, when you look at a lot of politics, people will always tell you, well, maybe you should just follow the money. And the point that Melissa just raised, I believe there's been some calculations to say that these really church organizations that engage in these type of activities account for almost $1 trillion worth of service. So now you're talking about really taking a group that's basically taking $1 trillion of activity that they're doing that doesn't have any quote unquote taxpayer, power or feelings, or should be causing a community to feel like, great, we're not funding that. And now you're potentially causing a group to say, I might have to walk away from this completely. And so if you think about this just from a financial standpoint, I'm not even sure the country can afford this.
And what you're describing, Orlin, really gets to the heart of the irrationality that defines our current culture war landscape, because you have people on one side digging their heels in and taking a very hostile view toward religion. On the other side, you have folk who perhaps are a little irrational in how they try to relate to people who have a very different lifestyle, for instance, than them. And so you have two sides that think they're locked in a zero-sum conflict, and it harms no one but themselves and the rest of the country as well. And so somehow we need to get this conversation to move past this sort of zero-sum rhetoric that we're locked into. And you know what? I think it's fair to suggest that religious folk have both fault in the current level of dialogue about these issues. I mean, not without blame. And we need to step up our game. But then again, those on the other end of the spectrum who are hostile, who are actively hostile toward faith, and we see this in the case that we're talking about now, there is animus against religious folk, no matter how much good they're doing. They need to also tap into a bit of rationality as well. And somehow we need to get a dialogue going.
You know, Carmela, a group can put 40 years of service into something and then basically just be ignored as though they never existed. But the crazy thing that I'm really trying to get, wrap my mind around is these are the types of organizations that have made it very clear that if you ask us to leave, we will leave. I mean, Catholic organizations have said, change the rules, it doesn't work for us, we're out. And the idea that you're really going to be almost pushing a group that has been successful to kind of leave the stage or leave the arena seems to, create a multiplicity of issues, not just the fact that they were good at what they were doing. I mean, what are these guys thinking about, or am I missing something here?
I think we're all missing something, and I'm going to take this from a different and cynical, skeptical point of view. Number one, I don't think they're leaving Catholic Charities. They are doing a good job. Everybody admits it and knows it. You're dealing with two different cases here. One side of the case, or a very respected service that Catholic Charities offers in this instance, that is of resettling refugees, including refugees who are part of the LGBTQ community. All right. So they're already doing that. Right. And so they don't have a problem with servicing members of this community. All right. But then you have the other case where the state of Michigan, or Lansing in particular, is saying, well, we're not sure we want you, Catholic Charities, to place any of our adoption or foster care children in same-sex headed households. Right. So we got both sides playing both sides. Now, the only thing that is at issue is not this big contract regarding the resettlement of the refugees, is a small, how much? How small? $4,500. I said 4500 contract that helps people, or allows Catholic Charities to teach people about home buying and home maintenance. That is the contract that Lansing wanted to pull as a tit-for-tat retaliatory measure. Lansing, you notice, did not pull the plug on the resettlement project. They need Catholic Charities to help them with the resettlement, but they can, on the other hand, say, oh, we're not going to give you extra money on this little contract to make a point. And I, for one, I think is important anytime you have a religious charity or religious organization offering services to people in the community funded by the government. Everybody needs to stop and take a moment and reassess and evaluate, is this appropriate in this case? As we talked earlier, there's a delicate dance when you're talking about moving in between church and state, and whether we're centering the rights of people or we're centering the establishment, making sure we're not endorsing or prohibiting religion. We do need to take a long, hard look. In this case, this is a big, well, I'm not going to characterize it, but it's $4,500, people. Come on.
But Carmela, the thing that bothers me is the rhetoric that surrounded this discussion as well, right? Like, yes, it might not be a lot of money, but here they are. You have commissioners, calling this charity morally bankrupt, right? And this is the charity that they rely on and they partner with, and it's like, so they're still demonizing this group based on their religious view, and it's uncalled for, really, because they're having it both ways, right? Like, here, provide all these services, great job, but you're morally bankrupt as well.
Yeah.
And Catholic Church Services is having it both ways. They're getting the contract. They got money, 2 and 3 contracts. Okay, you don't like it? It's service. This is what God asked you to do. Go and get it done. That's where I am. I'm sorry.
Well, Melissa, this is where I kind of come down on wondering about this intertwine between church and state. At some point, some of these organizations may now have people and organizations coming to them saying, we need to see your books and records. We need to make sure that you're spending this money properly. We need to really get involved in that. And that's where religious organizations, time out, flag on the play. You don't get involved in that. But when you're taking this money, isn't that where we're going to probably end up?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The more that you intertwine with a partner, right, in any aspect of life, the more comfortable they will feel being intimate, right, with you. But yeah, you're exactly right. As far as the government is going to expect, we are partners in this together. Let's be transparent. And I have expectations for you as a partner, and the same.
And I'll let that be the last word, but that's one of the key issues we have to figure out. What are the expectations once I decide that I'm going to take in these resources? And I think those are some answers we have not completely seen as yet. And Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orland. So in the 5th grade, we were assigned a project to write an essay on someone that we admired. And you want to guess, Orland, who I wrote on? I wrote on Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.
Wow. Boy, Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Since we were just talking about Michigan, did you know that Michigan is the only place in the world with a floating post office with its own zip code?
I didn't know that. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So, Orland, did you know that when Justice O'Connor graduated from law school in the 1950s, she couldn't get a job because she was a woman. So she offered to work for a district attorney for free, and that's how she got her first job.
Wow. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
As we've seen, the current court is sort of dismantling the legacy of Justice O'Connor when it comes to religious establishment cases, and it prioritizes religious rights over civil rights. Justice Sotomayor really brings that home in a recent case where she is basically saying church and state is already gone. It is now a constitutional violation to balance that interest.
Wow. Ladies, it was great having you here with us. Great conversation. I think we'll be talking about some of these issues as well down the road. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.